You want to make sure that all your employees understand tax benefits that they have coming to them. So the Child Independent Care Tax Credit is one example. And so you can have flyers or you can provide workshops to help them with that. And you want to make sure that they feel that caregiving is valued and is not a stigma, that you have other obligations outside of work. And so that happens with policies and practices that you develop, and that we know, and Mike, you just told me about your own family experience, that caregiving does not stop. And so certainly while they're in your home through age 18, you continue to have needs, but also your aging parents have needs. And so there are ways that you can incorporate family-friendly policies for both childcare and elder care.
Good morning, HR. I'm Mike Coffey, and this is the podcast where I talk to business leaders about bringing people together to create value for shareholders, customers, and the community. Please follow, rate, and review Good Morning HR wherever you get your podcast. You can also find us on Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, or at goodmorninghr.com. It is June, and summer is here. For many families with young children, that means vacations, summer enrichment programs, and "Dad, I'm so bored." But for many families, summer also comes with the additional challenge of childcare. And for families with infants and toddlers, that is a year-round challenge. So today, we're starting a 2-episode discussion around the state of childcare in the U.S. and its impact on employees. Next week, we'll dive deeper into the ways businesses are helping employees meet those challenges. And joining me today is Katie Ferrier. She is the VP of Education and Workforce Development for the San Antonio Chamber of Commerce, where she advocates for strong business climate and strong quality of life. And in that role, she partners with the Council for a Strong America's Ready Nation Project, where they address national issues affecting maintaining a skilled U.S. workforce. Welcome to Good Morning HR, Katie.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
So, you're with the San Antonio Chamber. What is the Ready Nation Project, and how does the Chamber plug into that?
So this is a coalition of business leaders from across the country that come together to talk about how to build a stronger workforce and an economy. So we promote public policies and programs that do just that. And I started working with them here in Texas on the issue of childcare. And then they invited me to come to DC earlier this year, to help them release their latest research report on the economic impact of the childcare crisis.
And that's the report, $122 billion, the growing annual cost of the infant-toddler childcare crisis.
Right. So focusing just on insufficient access to childcare for infants and toddlers. So this is kids under age 3. The estimated cost is $122 billion in lost earnings, productivity, and tax revenue.
From not having a childcare system that's really resilient.
Correct. Yes. So productivity could mean being late or absent for your employees because they haven't been able to their childcare center's not open, or it was far away and they got caught in traffic. They're distracted at work because they keep getting calls from the childcare center or the nanny that there's a problem and they need to leave early, that they can't commit to take a trip for work, or they have to turn down a special project at work. And so then that has a cost to employer. Their employee is not as focused and able to be as productive as they need. And then they have costs related to turnover if those employees have to quit or, in fact, be fired. And
then you mentioned not being able to take a promotion. That's negative for the employer and the employee. I mean, that curtails development of the workforce in a lot of ways, where somebody, if, none of us ever, and, I'm dancing a jig because we just finished our first year as being an empty nesters. And so we've got all 3 of our sons off on somebody, 2 of them off somebody else's payroll, and one paying for a ridiculous amount of college right now, but at least he's not under my roof. But I do remember those days, even as a business owner, There were days where I had to make choices. Okay, I'm going to do this, or, that'll generate revenue and move things forward, or am I going to do this other thing, which my kid's always going to win, right? But if we make those choices or face those choices on an ongoing basis, I can see where, especially someone whose livelihood and career is dependent on serving a company and doing that kind of, and developing and growing, would really cut those opportunities out.
So it impacts their personal economies, certainly, and then it impacts the employer economy. But if there's less business and those individuals are earning less pay, then there's also less tax revenue for local and state governments. So it has an impact on all of us. It's not just a problem for an individual parent who wants to go to work.
And I think when we talk about child lack of access to childcare, I think a lot of us have a gut instinct that we're talking about lower wage workers here. Who does this really affect? What economic demographic does this really seem to affect?
Well, we find that it's not just low-income families that are impacted. If you think about the cost of infant and toddler childcare, it costs more than private school college tuition in the majority of the states in the United States. So that is hitting people at the time of probably their lowest income earning potential. So you have to think about younger adults that have just entered the workforce that are perhaps paying off college student loan debt themselves. And then now we're asking them to shoulder the burden of enormous costs of childcare.
So paying childcare is like paying for state college. That's a big number.
Yes.
And you're paying it 12 months out of the year probably.
Correct.
And not just for, 6 or 8 or whatever 2 semesters looks like. That's a big cost, and so young professionals or even those, heaven forbid, and later in our careers who are suddenly in a position where we're parents, maybe we weren't maybe even expecting it, but you make those choices and decide you want to be the best parent possible, and that. But you've got to arrange to take care of the kids.
And it isn't just cost, it's also access. So a number of communities across the country are what are considered childcare deserts. That means that there are so few centers or slots available. So it's not just centers, it could also be folks that provide care in their home available to children that you're on a waiting list for months at a time before you can have access to that.
So when we're talking about childcare in general, are there strata of what do we consider quality childcare? I mean, I was that 80s kid who came home and was in front of the TV waiting for my parents to come home. And I get the sense that a lot of parents today are a lot less comfortable with doing that. And maybe it's better for the kids that they weren't. I don't know that it did me any good to watch Power Rangers every day after school for a while. But
well, you can always enjoy Power Rangers. But so there are accreditation agencies, both at the national level and then in states, that will help establish good quality care. And that does cost more. But there's proof that shows that if young brains are involved in enrichment activities, that, it means a lot more. They're more successful in school when they get ready to enter kindergarten. They are prepared. And, we know that brain development under the age of 5 is so crucial. And if a child starts in kindergarten behind, they very often stay behind.
And so what kinds of issues affect that quality of childcare?
So the education of the providers, that they are trained in working with young babies and toddlers, that they understand brain development, that they have enrichment activities that are age appropriate, and also that it's safe, that they are licensed child care provider, that they've been inspected and that they have insurance coverage so that we can keep our precious babies as safe as possible. But I want to make a point here that the childcare crisis is a two-generation problem. So yes, it's very important that we are helping our children be ready for school success in the future, but it's also to allow adults, our current workforce, to be prepared to go into work. So that's why we think that this is an issue that really deserves a lot of attention. And so I was in DC to advocate for our federal lawmakers to provide more resources, to provide childcare access and make it more affordable, but also to support the industry, stabilize that workforce. We've seen centers closing all across the country, and that's very problematic.
Yeah, I imagine COVID was really hard on that industry. We're a background investigations company, and we do one of our unique niches is working with families and nanny agencies around the country who are placing, nannies and really well-trained, well-qualified folks in people's homes to care for their kids. And I saw for those folks, their business went up because so many of the quality facilities during COVID were shut down. So what did COVID do to the destination care facilities where somebody would take their kids?
Yeah, the centers were really impacted. So they had employees that couldn't come into work just like any other business because they were home caring for their own children or they had health concerns. And then they had less children coming into the center, so they had less income. And then because of some of the safety mechanisms, they could care for fewer children. They needed to have higher ratios of staff to children. And so that greatly impacted their income streams. And it's already a business model that has pretty tight numbers. Now, many governments, both state and local as well as federal, sent out rescue payments to childcare providers across the country. And we have heard that has helped a great deal, that they have stayed open or they were able to reopen. But those funds are running out. And so I know here in Texas that we are expecting another probably 30% of centers and providers to close by the fall because they won't have that revenue source anymore.
And I can guess that there are parents who are making the choice. We're not past COVID, and I think we're probably a little bit more germaphobes than we were 3 years ago. So, if I'm thinking about sending my kid to a child care center even a well-regarded one, I'm second guessing that myself. There's some, because I want my kid to stay healthy and not be exposed. And we always hear about, my kid brought this home from school or whatever, and it infected the whole family. And so I would guess that's really impacting at least some families' hesitancy to return to that environment. But like you say, short of not doing that, then how do you get the work done? How do you produce the income you need?
Right. And that means that some families can make a choice, but not all parents have a choice. If they're the sole breadwinner for their family, they need to go to work and they need to make sure that their child is in a safe place. And don't we all want to make sure that that's possible for them? So
you mentioned that you were advocating at the congressional level, at the federal level, to for policies that would help there. What kind of policies would those be?
So expanding federal funding that goes to help subsidize childcare, so lower income families are able to access subsidies in their states, and it is only reaching about 40% of families that are eligible. So we'd like for more families to be able to access those. It allows them to be fully involved in our economy and giving back. So we think it's well worth the return on investment.
And are most of those programs at the federal level? Are there state level programs for those kinds of things?
So they'll send grants to states, and then states design their own programs based on that. Yeah. But I did make clear when I was visiting with member offices that I wasn't just coming to ask them to do their part, that we felt that the private sector has a role too. So I tried to give them examples of how I see employers trying to step up and help in their communities and help their employees. But one thing that I when I have, the U.S. Chamber also invites me to come and speak to folks. And so when they ask me, I always encourage business leaders to, you need to know your employees. I encourage you to survey them and find out what sort of caregiving needs that they have. And then that's going to help you develop programs that work best for you. And it's important to ask them anonymously so that they can answer truthfully about the demands that they have. But it may be that, there's not as many folks that need infant care as you might have expected, and that they need support in other ways. You want to make sure that all your employees understand tax benefits that they have coming to them. So the child independent care tax credit is one example. And so you can have flyers or you can provide workshops to help them with that. And you want to make sure that they feel that caregiving is valued and is not a stigma, that you have other obligations outside of work. And so that happens with policies and practices that you develop, and that we know, and Mike, you just told me about your own family experience, that caregiving does not stop. And so certainly while they're in your home through age 18, you continue to have needs, but also your aging parents have needs. And so there are ways that you can incorporate family-friendly policies for both childcare and elder care.
And let's take a quick break. Good Morning HR is brought to you by Imperative, premium background checks with fast and friendly service. 24 years ago, I founded Imperative to help risk-averse companies make well-informed decisions about the people they involve in their business. Often that involves giving employers thorough and easy-to-understand background checks on prospective employees. But sometimes it means helping families make well-informed decisions when hiring nannies or other caregivers. Outside of employment, we help services firms with their client acceptance and know your customer requirements. And we help investors research the principles in firms in which they are considering making private equity placements. Basically, if people are involved, there's risk involved. We help companies identify and mitigate that risk. You can learn more about Imperative at imperativeinfo.com. If you're an HRCI or SHRM certified professional, this episode of Good Morning HR has been pre-approved for 1/2 hour of recertification credit. To obtain the recertification information, visit goodmorninghr.com and click on Research Credits. Then select episode 98 and enter the keyword childcare. That's CHILDCARE. And now back to my conversation with Katie Ferrier. So what are some of those, what are some, we all went remote, and a lot of us, including my company, stayed remote. And so that was, that's been interesting, and it's been, really positive for my young adult employees who, have young families. And I'll see, we're constantly in contact via Zoom, chat, and all of those things during the day. And I'll see somebody drop in a note saying, I'll be back in 15 minutes. I'm going to feed Asa, or, whatever it is. And we're really cool with that. And I think the more successful employers working remote have found that to be a real benefit. But what other policies are you seeing employers implement that seem really helpful in this area?
Yeah, if I could just add to that, I'll tell you that one good thing that came out of the pandemic and all of us working from home was that you couldn't deny that you had staff or colleagues that had children, and you could see the impact that they had on their ability to focus and work. And so I think that was really helpful to us to all be open and vulnerable with one another about those demands. And I'm pleased that it's allowed some people to think differently about how to support their staff. So flexible work options, much like what you suggested about saying, I'll be right back, and that allowing parents to dip in and out of the workday if they have to deal with a sick child, or they have school pickup or school drop off, and that as long as folks are delivering on their work outcomes, that you're understanding of that. But on the other side, for some workplaces, it's not remote, and as much as you can adopt consistent or predictable scheduling, allows them to make caregiving decisions in advance and plan for that, or budgeting for that care in advance, it's going to help them be more successful and have longer lasting relationships with caregivers.
And I think that's something whenever that conversation around predictable work schedules comes up, and there's been legislation at a number of states around that. Those of us who work kind of white collar 9-to-5 jobs really don't get the importance or what it really means, or don't think about it until it's pointed out to us. Can you talk a little bit more about what predictable work schedules means and what kinds of employees are really impacted by that?
Sure. So if they can know in advance, not just I've learned on Sunday what my next 6 days of work are, but if I know a couple of weeks out, if not longer, how many days I'll be working so that I can arrange care for my child. And that I know if I'm working the later shift those days, that I've arranged for somebody to pick them up after school, and that they can plan ahead and make sure that their child is safe and is in where they need to be. And that allows them to focus on work and not be constantly worried about what's happening with their child.
And so these are shift workers, often restaurant employees, folks who are, scheduled according to business need, those kinds of things. And so
That's right. So my brother's in hospitality, and it's very frustrating for he and his wife that, he only gets a week's notice and what his schedule is, but that in other hotels that he's visited, they've planned it out in advance. So they know that this person works this shift. And sometimes it means that person earns a little bit more because they may be taking a shift that's not as desirable. But other times it's you take it for this period of time and then I get it another time. So that those families can plan ahead, that they know they're going to need a nanny, or they know they're going to need to carpool with that other family for the next, month, but then they can pick it up again and trade off. So it just makes it easier for them.
So predictable scheduling, what other kinds of things are you seeing employers do that really help these kinds of employees?
So they help subsidize care. So they may be giving cash payments. They may create flexible savings accounts that folks can use for childcare. Sometimes I'll see them work out discounts directly with local providers. So it's really important that you know local providers surrounding your office or your facility. And then that's something that you can use as a recruitment tool. Let them know in advance, here's some options that are close to work so you can hit it on your commute, or for shift work, if you're working outside of 9 to 5, here are some providers that are open late. I've also seen them develop contracts with nurses for backup care, for sick care. So their employees may have good relationships already of steady care, but then when their child is sick and they can't go into that center or they can't go into that other person's home, they have a hotline that they can call that morning and then arrange for care. Or sometimes I've seen them set aside accounts where we give you so many days of backup care that we will reimburse you. So you still have to find that caregiver, and maybe it's your mother-in-law, or maybe it's a neighbor, or you hire a babysitter to come in, but we'll help reimburse that care, $50 to $100 a day, depending on the market.
How common is on-site childcare? That conversation used to seem like it came up a lot, and I don't know that I've heard a lot about it post-COVID.
Well, it's pretty expensive, and it's very time-intensive. I think there were some folks that were really excited to think about, how fun it will be to be able to see the babies in our on-site, and it'll be so easy then for our new parents to visit their children throughout the day if they're breastfeeding or just want to visit with them. But then once you start doing the investigation of really what it takes to develop it on-site, and a few years ago, the reimbursement or the tax credit rather from the federal government of up to $150,000 was worth it. It covered a pretty good amount of creating that situation in your workplace. But now that's not as much the case. So we're seeing more employers try to contract with third-party providers. So it may be doing some of the things that I've suggested that an individual employer could do, providing a resource list of local providers, helping to run the flexible spending accounts, and also helping to find, local providers that would reserve seats or would provide other, discounts for that. And then it also will work with your employees about maximizing their tax credits too.
And you mentioned earlier about working with organizations that were accredited, and I know certainly when I'm on talking to nanny agency owners, they have long list of educational opportunities and certifications. And so we're really not talking just about babysitting here, right? I mean, we're really talking about investing in our workforce in a lot of ways,
Yes.
as a country and as employers, and helping ensure that next generation of citizen and employee is developed and ready. And certainly in the summer, we see all the studies about how far back 2 or 3 months of a lack of activity, of schooling or whatever impacts, especially underserved communities, kids. And so that ongoing investment in making sure that these kids are engaged and are learning seems like a no-brainer, right? I mean, of all the dumb things that we spend money on, this seems like one that would be an obvious thing for both the government and employers to invest in.
Well, I'm glad to hear you say that. I certainly think it seems obvious.
And I'm the crazy libertarian in most of the circles I hang out in, and I still think it seems like a good idea.
It is a good idea. It is a very good investment. We are not talking about just plopping little babies in a room with a pile of toys and occasionally changing their diaper. No, these are instructors, educators that are working with our children to help them learn their numbers and colors, certainly, but also about how to collaborate with others and how to communicate with folks that are not in your family. And that's really important for them to develop relationships with folks that are not their parents or not their siblings. It makes them more ready for school.
So if I'm an employer and I see that maybe I'm having employees who are calling out on a pretty regular basis, or claiming PTO, burning up their PTO for a variety of what kind of issues beyond should I be paying attention to suggest maybe I've got an issue here with my workforce that I might be able to help them with?
Yeah, well, like I said, I think it's really important that you ask them, because it may be that it's something very clear and straightforward that, they're sharing a car and it makes it harder to drop off the child on time and get to work on time. But other times it may be that their slot is no longer available. And so now they're having to piecemeal together with other caregivers to watch their child, and it makes them very uncomfortable, or that individual is not able to handle it. So they're constantly calling about a behavior issue, or I don't know where this is. And, you need to tell me how many, ounces of formula they should be getting today and things like that. And we don't want them to have to make those choices. And so I think it's really important, though, that you can't always predict what that problem may be. So you do need to ask them. And that's something that you can ask, very early on and in a supportive way that folks feel like they can be honest and answering. Yeah.
One thing I've seen is one of our just best employees and most valuable employees has childcare on a consistent basis with a private provider. But if that provider is sick, she's scrambling to find childcare for her kid, and still be there for the company. And she's one of those employees that I'm blessed to have who, will always try to find a way to make it work. And sometimes I think we have to push back a little bit and say, hey, just take the day.
Right.
Do what you got to do. And because it's, one thing we've experienced personally is in our firm is that it's almost impossible, especially with the younger children, to multitask, to take, and heaven forbid, if I ever had to do that, I would be useless, to both the kid and the job. But and just, there's days where we just have to say, take the time. That's what the PTO is for. And even if their PTO is gone, we as a company are never going to penalize an employee for taking care of their family. That's, and I'm lucky that I've got, a whole group of exceptional employees who support each other as well. But I think there's a lot of that probably under the radar in larger organizations, and they don't even recognize what's really going on. So suddenly you've got an employee who seems like they're not engaged or not supporting what's going on in the organization, isn't, and in reality, they've got other issues. And if you don't ask, you're not going to know.
That's right. That's right. Because it's very often, I've heard some people describe it as I'm living in a house of cards, that all it takes is for one little thing to go wrong. And I certainly have experienced that as a parent myself, that, if my carefully constructed arrangements of how I have my work schedule and my daughter's care schedule and care for my parents, if one thing gets out of whack or is not what I expected it to be, it has a ripple effect throughout everything. And it can be very stressful, and it has made me have to change plans unexpectedly.
So any last words of advice to employers who really want to make it easier for their employees to be amazing employees and amazing parents?
Yes. It's that please do ask and try to help, but also recognize that you're not alone in this, that there are other agencies that want to be contributing to this solution. It shouldn't be up to each individual employer to solve this crisis for all of their employees. You should be letting your local elected officials know that this is a problem. You should consult other employers in your community and see how they are handling it. And maybe you can combine resources. And you should definitely let folks like Ready Nation know. And we'd love to help you too.
And as a business owner, I can say that your local chamber probably has a workforce development and business attraction and retention functions, and they can probably put you in contact with other employers who are going through the same things, but also the right people, and plug you right into the right organizations to get that support.
And you don't have to have all the answers, and don't expect everyone you call to have all the answers. This is a major crisis across the country, and we are all still figuring it out. But that shouldn't stop us from trying to do so.
Well, that is the time we have. I thank you for joining me today, Katie.
Thank you.
And thank you for listening. You can comment on this episode or search our previous episodes at goodmorninghr.com or on Facebook, Instagram, or YouTube. And don't forget to follow us wherever you get your podcasts. Rob Upchurch is our technical producer, and you can reach him at robmakespods.com. And thank you to Imperative's marketing coordinator, Marianne Hernandez, who keeps the trains running on time. And I'm Mike Coffey. As always, don't hesitate to reach out if I can be of service to you personally or professionally. I'll see you next week, and until then, be well, do good, and keep your chin up.